Bem, em primeiro lugar, queria agradecer, muito obrigado à Núria, e à Clara e ao Pablo pelo convite, e vou começar com um pedido de desculpas triplo. Em primeiro lugar, porque, apesar de entender quase perfeitamente o espanhol, falo muito mal, e, portanto, quando perguntei à Núria e à Clara se deveria falar em português ou em inglês, foi-me sugerido que talvez pudesse falar em português. Mas se for muito difícil de entender para vocês, posso mudar. Preferem que eu fale inglês? Inglês? Okay. So that's perfectly fine. I just prepared the stuff in English, in Portuguese, but I can just completely adapt it to English. Okay, so as I was saying, I was excusing myself because I was going to speak in Portuguese. Now I'm excusing myself because I'm going to speak in English and not in Spanish. But I do understand Spanish, okay? So feel free to ask questions in Spanish, okay? Second, I don't really like PowerPoints. But since I was supposed to speak in Portuguese, I figured that just including a lot of stuff of the text, and I'm not presenting a paper, in the PowerPoint could be useful, so that you just get more or less a grip of what I'm talking about. And also, I'm not presenting anything original here. I'm not presenting a paper. I'm just doing as I was told. That is, I'm supposed to do like a possible genealogy of suffering, the question of suffering in this case of the third generation of critical theory, which is the generation that I'm more acquainted with. And so that's what I'm doing. So I'm just doing like a quick overview of the way in which suffering basically appears in Axel Honneth, okay? And a bunch of other figures closely associated with third generation critical theory, such as namely Emmanuel Renaud, and then, for instance, Christophe Dejour. I'm assuming that you're acquainted with his work, who is not a critical theorist per se, but that has heavily influenced some of the authors that work at the intersection between the theory, Axel Honneth's theory of recognition, on the one hand, and the psychopathology or psychodynamics of work as defined by Christophe Dejour. And so the logic of the presentation, let's say, is to show more or less how the notion of suffering and social suffering appears in Honneth, and then how it translates to the problem of suffering within work, and then just briefly mentioning the problem of precarity and bullshit jobs, such as they appear as concrete cases of social suffering. And I guess that this is more or less some of the stuff that interests you here in this PhD seminar. I was planning on speaking very, very slowly because I understood that you were not going to understand what I'm saying. Now that I think that you will understand what I'm saying, I will afford myself maybe to speak a little faster. So just I tried to get to the end of the presentation. So, and I was saying I'm not including a lot of my own work here, but if I get to the end, I'll speak a little bit about it in my final notes. Okay. So, Axel Honneth. How many of you are really, really very well acquainted with Honneth? Do you know that? Are you at least a little bit acquainted with his work? Not at all? Ah, that's interesting. Okay, so not so fast after all. Okay, so we just skipped Habermas, and that's all right. You don't need to know anything about Habermas. But usually when we speak about first generation critical theory, we speak, the center in the periphery. The center is, of course, Horkheimer and Adorno. Second generation, more or less Habermas, and the other less well-known figures. And then when we speak about so-called third generation, that is the people that came after Habermas, you usually mention Axel Honneth, you mention Nancy Fraser, a lot of the feminist authors, etc. but in what comes down to, let's say, the people who were at the helm of the Institute for Sozialforschung in Frankfurt, etc., Hannett is one of the main figures. How can you understand his background? He's someone who, from the beginning, is trying to put forward, let's say, a strand of critical theory that is simultaneously influenced and trying to depart from Habermasian critical theory and the linguistification of critical theory, let's say, by mixing his own intuitions with Foucault's analysis of power, for instance, in biopolitics, etc., on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to make sense of the Marxist Hegelian tradition within critical theory. He starts off as some sort of heterodox Marxist, and then he comes to his own standpoint by making some sort of reactualization of Hegel's social theory through some sort of mix with modern social psychology, Donald Winnicott, George Herbert Mead, and stuff like that. His most well-known book is The Struggle for Recognition, of which I'm going to speak a little bit. But just to show the genealogy of how suffering appears in his work, I'm starting a little bit earlier in this entry point to the presentation. And so, in his early work, that is in the 1980s, there's one particular piece which is important in this genealogy, which is this one, Moral Consciousness and Class Domination, Some Problems in the Analysis of Hidden Morality, which is a text from 1981, and that has been republished widely, including in this English collection of his works titled Disrespect, the Normative Foundations of Critical Theory. Okay, so in this specific piece, what is Hannett doing and how does suffering appear there? He talks about suffering as some sort of hidden morality. Okay, hidden suffering, sufrimento escondido, it's hidden suffering. So he wants to go beyond the limitations of a critical social theory, which is basically centered, such as Habermasian social theory is, in communicative rationality, and to rethink the role of social conflict and asymmetric relations of power within society through the lens of this problem of hidden suffering, let's say. And so his main problem is how to frame he calls it a latent class conflict tied to social suffering, which is caused by social domination, but which in some cases might be unable to express itself. So just a little bit of context here. One of the main problems within the tradition of Frankfurt-style critical theory has always been, why the hell didn't the proletariat make the revolution? I mean, if for Lukács the proletariat was, let's say, the universal class, which had no particular interests because they had nothing, no material possessions. And so if the proletariat was the social class that embodied the revolution, why the hell didn't they do it? Okay. And so for many theorists in the Frankfurt tradition, and for instance also Habermas, the social welfare state was part of the problem, because actually capitalism had bought bought the people, because people were getting fridges and televisions and money for free, etc. And so they no longer shared an interest in doing the revolution. And so, for instance, in the early Habermas, there's a critique of the social welfare state because of that problem. And so, as seen from Habermasian social theory in the 1980s, it seemed as if class conflict no longer existed. Okay? And what the early Hannett is trying to say is that that's not true. Class conflict does exist, domination still exists, but in many cases it is hidden, it is latent. And critical social theory at that point in time was not paying attention to this problem of hidden suffering, because it was centering on arguments. It was centered on the linguistification. And so if you didn't have a claim that could be translated into a communicative ethics or whatever, it was as if the problem did not exist. And so Hannett at this early point was trying to struggle against that vision. And so he was claiming that Habermasian social theory was ignoring the forms of suffering and critique not immediately communicated under the form of arguments and claims, and as such recognized by the political public sphere, which Habermas was dealing with at the time. And he was also pointing to a problem which perhaps nowadays we would spell out in the terms of epistemic injustice, following Miranda Fricker's work, which is the fact that many of these people, I mean the former proletariat, if you will, I mean the poor working classes, had lower access to the epistemic mechanisms that were able to, let's say, make them able to articulate their own social justice claims. And so they would not spontaneously tend to articulate their experiences of injustice, and so they would fall short from articulating the critique to the class domination they were being subjected to. But that fact would not automatically entail that they would not have like a felt perception of those experiences of injustice. And so it would become, let's say, a task, a crucial task for critical social theory, precisely to articulate these hidden injuries of class, following the vocabulary of Richard Sennett in the famous book Hidden Injuries of Class, and to articulate the, let's say, critical potential in this so-called hidden morality that was for Hannah at the time a socially repressed moral conflict. Okay, conflito moral socialmente reprimido. It's my emphasis. And so, in a nutshell, Hannah would say that this socially repressed hidden conflict would contain some sort of latent potential of revolt that could be able to reanimate labor struggles against exploitation and a plea for some sort of alternative paradigm that at this point in time you would see as the organization of labor in collective terms and a critique of work conditions under capitalism at that point. So this was the very, very early on. Then, luckily enough, I was resorting to the English translations, and so the references for the English translations of Hannah here. So this is the well-known book. It's still early on. It's a book published originally in German in 1992, and then translated in 1995, called The Struggle for Recognition, The Moral Grammar of Social Conflicts. So, very quickly, just to explain the overall framework of the book. Now, the theme of The Struggle for Recognition, a neo-Hegelian theme that you're acquainted with, I guess. So it's basically the intuition according to which social relations are formed through patterns of recognition, through spheres of recognition that have struggle at their center, let's say. What Hannah tries to do at this specific point in time is to reactualize the young Hegel from the Jena period. I don't really have the time to explain this right now, but basically it's the period in which Hegel had not written the phenomenology of spirit yet, and so he hadn't fall back into a theory of consciousness for itself, let's say, not the overarching totalization of a spirit that goes out of itself in order to come back to itself and know itself through the figures of the spirit. No, it was for Habermas and Hannah at this point in time, the more, let's say, they would call it post-metaphysical, even though Hegel would not spell this out in these terms, but the still intersubjectivist Hegel, seeing recognition from an intersubjective standpoint and not from the standpoint of the formation of self-consciousness, etc. So it tries to pick up on this intuition that basically before we have our own personal identities, we are social beings embedded in a thick network of relations. We are relational beings that need recognition need intersubjective recognition in order to form our own personal identities. We have a legitimate moral expectation of validity and recognition coming from others, and we have a duty of recognition of the diversity of others in several spheres, and if and when that legitimate expectation is denied, if and when there is misrecognition or disrespect, then either the subject falters in suffering because he or she needs recognition in order to thrive, let's say, or if we are able to go beyond individual experiences, inform bonds of solidarity, understanding that certain experiences of suffering and misrecognition are typical for whole social groups, the minorities that are persecuted, women throughout history, and so on and so forth, maybe we are able to resist and transform society through collective struggles for recognition. And this is some of the recent history of let's say, at least some instances of the history of modernity in Western societies as a struggle of the expansion of the scope of rights through struggles for recognition that usually precede the institutionalization of such rights in law, in formal law. This is a very specific framework because following Hegel, it has like a tripartite scheme of the spheres of recognition. So he speaks of recognition in the sphere of love, which basically means personal relations, friendship, etc. Law and solidarity. And as I was basically saying, actually in his, let's say, anthropology, he speaks, he says, I mean, systematically we can explain this in the following sense. A sound constitution of subjectivity depends on what he calls reflective affections towards oneself. He says that in the sphere of love, we build relationship of self-trust through the trust that is, through the recognition that we gain through others. In the sphere of law, we build a relation of self-respect towards ourselves because we feel, it's kind of the Kantian paradigm, we feel basically a subject worthy of respect for his or her own rights like any other human being. And in the sphere of solidarity, we actually build esteem for the richness of the diversity of the plurality of life forms in society. Okay? And so when we struggle for recognition in the sphere of law, we're speaking about rights that should apply in the same manner for everyone. And so we are fighting, we are struggling against the exclusion of rights of certain individuals. And when we are fighting for recognition in the sphere of esteem, we are fighting for the specificity and the value of difference, let's say. When there is lack of recognition, misrecognition, or disrespect, this has, as a consequence, moral suffering, which is a consequence of disrespect. And ultimately, this will assume different forms according to the sphere of recognition we are speaking about. But in extreme cases, it might lead to psychological faltering. It might lead to the dissolution of subjectivity. Okay, will not explain this in length. If you don't know this, well, you can refer to the book, or you might take a picture if you want. But it basically this is taken from the book, The Struggle for Recognition. It basically just explains the overall framework of his book. So we have three primary forms of recognition: love, rights, and solidarity. And he explains which dimension of our personalities relates to each sphere. So in the sphere of love, we have our niche, our needs and emotions recognized and validated. The sphere of rights is tied to moral responsibility, and the sphere of solidarity is tied to our specific traits and abilities, etc. But very important is the practical relations, the practical relation to self that constitutes, as I was saying, self-confidence, self-respect, and self-esteem. Now, when we speak about instances of disrespect or misrecognition, and this is the part of suffering, okay? He basically shows how this lack of recognition is expressed in different experiences of suffering. So for instance, in the sphere of love, we have our physical integrity at stake, when, for instance, the form of recognition assumes the experiences of abuse, for instance. In the sphere of rights, what is at stake is our social integrity when we are excluded or denied of rights. And in the sphere of self-esteem, what we have is a threat to our own dignity when we are insulted, denigrated, subject to what sometimes we describe as moral humiliation. Okay, so different spheres of suffering. And what he's saying is that when these forms of suffering are very extreme, when intersubjective recognition is sapped from us in these extreme cases, ultimately we can be in a state of total emotional and psychical disarray, in states of extreme suffering. So in these cases, as you say, we have a feeling that we are deprived of reality, and ultimately we might lose confidence in ourselves, trust in ourselves, and in the world. So it is as if the reality is sacked from us. And then, this is just, I'm spelling out in this PowerPoint, in this slide, basically the consequences of the other, also of the other two instances of lack of recognition in the sphere of rights and in the sphere of esteem. So in the sphere of rights, when we are denied recognition, we no longer we are unable to see ourselves as a moral subject. Okay, so we lose self-respect. And when certain ways of life, for instance, minority ways of life, are disrespected, it is as if they had no value in themselves, and so so they would be not worthy of existence, something like that. There is obviously an empirical link between this notion of moral suffering, of disrespect, denigration, and humiliation, and the existence of certain feelings, of certain affections. For instance, humiliation, shame in this respect itself. And he speaks of moral injuries. That's the expression I'm using there, Friedrich Moraes. He uses moral injuries that ultimately can be tied to a possibility of revolt and collective resistance. For instance, through the feelings, this time around not of suffering, but of indignation and revolt, that are ultimately closely tied to this legitimate moral expectation that people had and that was not followed through. Now, I'm not going to develop this at length because I don't have the time to do it, but there's a very important development, which is, what conditions must be met in order for social subjects to be able to resist this rather than falter? Okay, because through the individualization of suffering, the most common case would be that people would continue to be silent, that they would just endure their suffering, the suffering caused by social causes. But what he says is that basically the key lies in communication and solidarity. That is, at the beginning, are you acquainted with Miranda Fricker's work, for instance, on epistemic injustice? Take her example of abuse, Carmita Wood, etc. At the beginning, people did not have the concept of abuse. And so women who were subject to abuse didn't have the linguistic instruments to describe their felt lived experience of abuse. And so they would be called crazy or lunatic or whatever, because it was felt as an individual experience. Something they would be blameworthy for their own individual behavior or whatever. As soon as they are able to translate their individual experience into a social experience, that is, no, this is something that many women go through, and that they are able to forge a concept and to describe appropriately an experience that is not individual, insofar as it is typical of a whole social group, then they are able to recognize abuse as abuse and denounce it as abuse. Mutatis mutandis, it's the same thing here. Okay? How do we resist to experiences of disrespect? He calls it, people have to build a semantic bridge connecting the meaning of their own individual experiences to the experience of a whole social group and form a movement of resistance in the form of a struggle for recognition that will express itself typically in social movements. And so we can say that he has not a totally pessimistic view of society, because he does have some sort of hope in 1992 that eventually he doesn't dream of a reconciled society or whatever, and he doesn't have like a direct political outcome for his vision of society as being moved by the struggle for recognition. But he does hope that through struggles for recognition, a small possibility of emancipation through the forms of domination of disrespect could be achieved. Basically, that's his vision. Now, a little later, he would speak about that. Now I'm transitioning to later stages in Honnett's critical theory. He will describe other types of suffering and directly tackle, at least a little bit, the problem of work and, I mean, the social institution of work. So he has a book from 2000 called Suffering from Indeterminacy. And at this point in time, so we're making a transition from the young Honnett to the mature Honnett, express it in these terms. It will also move, I don't know exactly why, probably it's a biographic stuff. Like, I'm getting older, so I should read the older Hegel too. So we will transition to, I'm sorry, this is being recorded, so I can't deny that I said this. So he takes up the Hegel of the philosophy of right. Okay? This is done the first time in the Spinoza lectures in 2000, and then in a more fully matured version, he fleshes it out in the book Freedom's Right, which is a book in 2011, and then translated in English in 2014. Now, what is he doing there? He's not dropping the model of the struggle for recognition, he's not dropping social movements, but he's taking the institutional approach. And that's the reason why he goes to Honnett's philosophy of right. And one of his main goals is basically to form or to forge a notion of freedom different from mainstream liberal versions of freedom. So it's not negative or positive freedom in Isaiah Berlin's famous distinction. It is basically a freedom that is embodied in the intersubjective patterns of recognition, such as they are also made possible by social institutions. Okay? I'm gonna skip the long. The only thing I wrote in English in this presentation. It's just one of the things he's doing is looking at the way in which Hegel looked at institutions, and so he, at some point, looks at the institution of the capitalist marketplace, and he also analyzes the capitalist modes of the organization of work within that framework, and at some point he basically mentions the problem of precarity as also entailing feeling a moral outrage of loss of recognition. And so I'm just going to mention the passages that are marked in emphasis, in bold. It says that if wage levels dropped, then the state reduction of income, coupled with the growing precariousness of employment, also entails a suffering associated with the loss of recognition due to work conditions, and that the threat of being laid off boils down to the resurgence of feelings of powerlessness, and so it is also a form of domination, and that ultimately this creates a widespread feeling of injustice tied with precarity and its other side, which is I mean, what is the ideological justification of precariousness from the standpoint of, you know, neoliberalism? It's flexibility, right? Mm-hmm. Are you acquainted with, I was going to mention this a little bit down the road, I don't know if I'll get there, if I have the time, but Boltanski and Chiapello, are you acquainted? The New Spirit of Capitalism, does that ring a bell? So, New Spirit of Capitalism, such as it appears in, you know, management manuals and stuff like that, is a lot associated with this figure of the entrepreneur, etc. And with, well, basically they claim that May 68 had autonomy as one of its staples, and then what happened was that capitalism in its neoliberal version basically appropriated the value of autonomy and turned it into a real consequence of precariousness masked as, you know, the apology of flexibility, autonomy, and stuff like that. And Honneth picks up those threads too. He mentions it explicitly in an interview I did with him. I'm not mentioning it here, but if it interests, I can send it to you. So Honneth, in this later stage, will mention the fact that these neoliberal transformations to work relations have as a consequence an isolation of individuals. It makes increasingly harder the phenomenon of collective resistance. You know, the semantic bridge he was talking about earlier, etc. And that this phenomenon of isolation can ultimately lead, before he was speaking about the dissolution of subjectivity, now he's speaking very concretely of suicides and stuff like that. He mentions, you know, the very, you know it for sure, what happened at France Telecom in 2008, 9, there was a wave of suicides in France Telecom. Many other people speak about that. De Jour will speak about that. Emmanuel Renaud will speak about that. You know, Honneth in this case too. So there's a danger that the feeling of solidarity will be lost, and that individuals will come to see the marketplace and especially the labor relations as being channeled only to fulfill individual needs rather than seeing it as an intersubjective mode of cooperation rooted towards the common good, blah, blah, blah. And so then very briefly, in a later book, will articulate the possibility of socialism as an alternative mode of coordination of human relations and labor relations. I'm going to go very quickly through this because I would like to speak a little bit about the other things too. But basically, so the book is The Idea of Socialism at a Tempo of Actualization or something like that, 2015 book, again translated to English in 2017. He basically argues that the idea of socialism shows the contingents of capitalism, and he defines it as what he calls an historical experimentalism coming from the claims of social movements, and he actually tries to decouple the idea of socialism from the idea of the working class taken alone. He sees the idea of socialism as emanating from political citizens rather than only from the salaried workers, let's say. And when he mentions historical experimentalism, that means that it's like a trial and error. Okay. He says that this could be realized through a market socialism, through the association of free producers, there is cooperatives, or through a stronger intervention of the state in the economy, or even stuff like basic income. I would like to speak a little bit about that later on, if possible. Okay. This is a seminar on social suffering and stuff like that. So Emmanuel Renaud, I'm gathering you know, more or less. Okay. So I'll go quickly through it, and I want to get to de jour, but basically I go through Emmanuel Renaud and Jean-Philippe Desranty because they basically they mix the influence of Honneth and the vision of critical social theory stemming from Honneth with the psychopathological and psychodynamical approach of work of de jour in order to do some sort of critical theory of work. And I guess it would be important to speak at least just a little bit about that. So, in the book, 2008 book, Souffrance sociale, philosophie, psychologie et politique. What's the goal? Is, I mean, put very shortly, to understand the type of suffering whose origins are specifically social and distinguishing normal, so-called normal, from abnormal suffering. And he claims that denouncing this type of suffering does not necessarily contribute to victimize people who go through them, but to basically, I'm putting this in there because he's addressing the same problem that Hannah was addressing in 1980, 1981, which is the incapacity in some occasions of subjects for psychological reasons, linguistic reasons, or reasons of labor relations and the fear of bosses and stuff like that, to articulate their own experiences of suffering at work and to construct some sort of social criticism through that. And so social suffering is seen as a psychic effect of domination and injustice. And again, a move typical of Honneth or Fricker, as I was mentioning. One of the advantages of this approach would be to stop attributing the responsibility of suffering to the individual and to describe its social causes, thus being able to pinpoint it, denounce it, and eventually struggle against it. And so it says very basic things, such as society distributes negative suffering experiences unequally, and this is a question of injustice. But when they are invisibilized, we don't say this, when they are made invisible, these injustices tend to reproduce themselves through time. And so this inequality or in the distribution of injustice as it persists through time basically contributes to the problem of domination through time. And so he tries to put forward a methodology of analysis which is interdisciplinary, drawing from psychology, drawing from sociology. And we'll analyze different types of social suffering at work, the suffering stemming from situations of poverty, denigration, stigmatization, etc. And he takes a social pathology approach that you're acquainted with, I guess, to the notion of social pathology from the tradition of critical social theory, which basically includes a normative moment of envisaging something like a non-pathological state, even though this has the status of an ideal. A sociological analysis of the causes of social suffering, and then also a psychological analysis of what happens when people internalize the effects of social suffering in their own affects. And ultimately also puts forward one of the versions of critical theory that Honneth puts forward, especially in his early work, which is the notion of disclosing criticism, erschließende Kritik, which basically tries to make visible hidden social problems of social suffering, hidden morality, etc., as I was speaking about at the beginning, in order to try to make sense of possible ways to respond to them also politically. Obviously, this is also tied to, Emmanuel Renaud and in others, to a critique of neoliberalism. And just to mention it very briefly, this is from an interview I also did with Emmanuel Renaud in this time around. And so two different interviews, one with Hannah, other with Emmanuel Renaud, this one from 2011. So a critique of liberalism understood simultaneously as a mode of accumulation of capital, with the center of profit, surplus value, etc., as a mode of governmentality in Foucault's sense, and marked by the procedure of control, evaluation, etc. A mode of politics, also tied to the deregulation or liberalization of the labor market and the destruction of the social state. And again, a discourse of justification or an ideology, because Boltanski and Capello's claim is that capitalism is able to survive and to conceal the possible alternatives to it by basically adapting its own discourse on values or the values associated with capitalism through time, and then almost always succeeds in adapting the mantra of neoliberalism, which is that no conceivable alternative is possible because it's still the best of possible worlds. Otherwise, just look at what happened in the Soviet Union and look at what happens in North Korea and so on and so forth. Coming to the end of my time, I don't know if I should proceed a little bit or just stop here. Should I speak a little bit about du jour? Just a little bit? Okay, du jour. Are you acquainted with Christophe du jour? Okay, so maybe I'll skip a little bit. You just as you know, he comes from a model of the psychopathology of work in 1980 to a model of the psychodynamics of work. So he skips a little bit the causal model and also analyze situations in which pleasure and resistance can be found at work. So I'm basically just skipping that, but it also comes to the conclusion that it is the social transformations of labor with the new discourse and practices of the new management that have direct consequences on this new form of social suffering at work, such as the emphasis and the productivity evaluations, the demand for total quality, the problem of outsourcing, and so we again come to the problem of solitude, despair, and all the problems of burnout, labor harassment, etc., and the possibility of suicide. There's an interview he gave to a Portuguese newspaper, Público, which I'm quoting here, which is very striking for the examples it gives. It mentions the case of someone who went to seek him because this was a woman that was very well adjusted, balanced, that had no depression, etc. And then a high-profile manager. And then at one point she had a meeting with the team, and each member of the team were giving a little kitten. You know where this is going, right? So basically they told the team that they had a mission, they had a job, and their job was to take care of the kitten for a week. And then 1 week after, they had a second meeting, and they were told that they had to kill the kitten. This is reported by Christophe du jour. When I sometimes speak about this in classes, my students don't believe it. And she was unable to do it. This is basically the hardcore version of, in capitalism and in high-scale management, you have to be ready to do anything. Like feelings don't count. You have to be ruthless. Okay, and she was unable to do it. I mean, she didn't do it, and she fell into a severe and acute depression because of that. Because her own personal moral standards, were not conciliable with her own ambition. Because she, at the same time, she also wanted to be a very successful person at work, etc., etc., etc. And so, this is an obvious case of social suffering caused by something that came from the world of work. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to come to the end of this, and I'm very sorry for that. I had a part where I analyzed how for de Jour and Jean-Philippe Derranty there was the thesis of the centrality of work and the way in which precarious labor relations basically affect existence as a whole. Okay, because they are not concilable. I mean, precarity cannot be reconciled with something which is very important in our own personal identities, which is the ability of make life plans. Okay, so precarity basically breaks our capacity to project action to the future and to make sense of the dialectics between the present time and the overall coherence of the future. I wanted to speak a little bit about this and then speak a little bit about the precarity with guys standing, blah, 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 doesn't matter. And also very briefly mention that poverty, precarity, etc. are not the only problems. Social suffering at work can also come from the fact of having a job which is basically pointless and meaningless and exists only for the sake of the very system that we have, and that's what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs, and he speaks about the spiritual violence associated with these jobs. which is the misery that comes from the fact of you're causing harm to others, or that you're doing something so useless that you have to fake that you're working because you're not actually doing something useless, etc. And one of the consequences is that they tend to destruct creativity, etc. Now, just to wrap it up in 1 minute, if I might. In my own work, I tend to look at this through the angle of what I like to call the miserable reason, the critique of miserable reason, in which has to do with some sort of reactualization of the critique of instrumental reason and its consequences nowadays. I guess that you can look at social suffering as one consequence of the invasion of the life world by technical and economical imperatives, and in this case, because of the unquestioned imperative of productivity at all costs and of incentives to action that lead to misery and despair. There's a role of neoliberalism in this. There's also a role of mainstream economic theory, namely neoclassical economic theory in this, and the way in which it looks as individuals as utility maximizers that are only seeking at all costs their own self-interests, and the way in which this gets naturalized within neoliberal social relations and social policy. And so I like to see a process of bad infinity in the Hegelian terms in this, in itself concealed because of the efficacy of the ideology of the spirit of capitalism. And I would like, not developing it, but I would like to argue that tackling these problems would entail finding an alternative to neoliberalism as social policy, obviously regulating labor practices in a way as to concede greater power to workers, also transform the symbolic order and the normative framework of our societies, which are basically stuck between an ideology that makes work the only dignified activity on the one hand, at an ideological standpoint, and on the other hand, the reality of work that brings social suffering, and eventually as a possibility, this is perhaps polemic, but I actually like the possibility of basic income, of renta básica, as a way to dissociate the capability of everyone to have an income that allows people to live with dignity from the need to work, because we actually don't have the need to work because capitalism is making people, as we heard, which are capitalism doesn't need all these people, but we need people to live. So basic income, by decoupling, disassociating these two things, instead of creating more and more and more bullshit jobs, perhaps basic income coupled with all these other possibilities would be a possible way out, not to eliminate, but to mitigate a little bit of this social suffering we're discussing here. And I ended up talking for 48 minutes, and I'm so very, very sorry. So that's it.